Madam President, yesterday, July the 26th, marked the 19th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act by President George Herbert Walker Bush, July the 26th, 1990. Passage of that law was a great national achievement. I remember being there. Obviously, I was the chief sponsor of the bill, and I was at the White House when it was signed. It was a beautiful sunny day, and more people were on the White House lawn for the signing of that bill than any signing of any bill in the history of this country. It's huge. It was a wonderful, wonderful day, and it was one of the landmark civil rights bills of our generation, of the 20th century. Passage of the original Americans with Disabilities Act was a bipartisan effort. As the chief sponsor of that bill here, I worked very closely with Senator Dole. Others on the other side of the aisle, two come to mind, Senator Orrin Hatch, who worked very closely with us to get it through, and also Senator Lowell Weicker of Connecticut. Senator Weicker really was the first proponent of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but by the time we were able to get it passed, he was no longer in the Senate. But Senator Weicker did really the yeoman's work and really getting it going and pulling everything together before he left the Senate. We received invaluable support from President Bush and key members of his administration. I would mention in particular White House Counsel Boyden Gray, Attorney General Richard Thornburgh, and Transportation Secretary Samuel Skinner. So we look back after 19 years, and what do we see? We see amazing progress. Thanks to the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA as we call it, streets, buildings, transportation is more accessible for people with physical impairments. Information is offered in alternative formats so that it's usable by individuals with visual or hearing impairments. Need I mention the closed captioning that one can be watching my speech on television right now? That closed captioning now going all over the country, not just for speeches on the Senate or the House floor, but for television programming and important events and weather announcements. Again, all started after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. These changes are all around us. Curb cuts, widened doorways, accessible buses, accessible trains. You never could get on an airplane before with a seeing eye dog. Now you get on an airplane, you see people come on with a seeing eye dog. They're allowed to do that. And so these changes are now so integrated into our daily lives, it's sometimes hard to remember what life was like before the ADA. After ADA, employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations so that people with disabilities have an equal opportunity in the workplace. There were four goals of the ADA, four stated goals in the law: equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. Last year, and again with broad bipartisan support, we were able to pass the ADA Amendments Act, overturning a series of Supreme Court cases that had greatly narrowed the scope of who is protected by the ADA. Beginning in 1999 and going through 2000, 2001, there was a series of cases. The three most important was what we call the Sutton, the Murphy, and the Kirkenberg cases that came before the Supreme Court. And in each of those cases, the Supreme Court did not really look at the report language and the findings that we had made here in the Congress on who is covered by the ADA, the fact that mitigating circumstances were not to be taken into account, and that there was not a demanding standard to be met. Well, the Supreme Court turned that on its head. They narrowed who was covered by the ADA. They said that mitigating circumstances had to be taken into account, and that there had to be a demanding standard for who was covered. Well, again, we worked on a bipartisan, bicameral basis to straighten out these hearings, to overturn the Supreme Court's findings, as a matter of fact. And we did. And we did it on a bipartisan basis, on both the House and the Senate. And President George Herbert Walker Bush's son, now President George Bush, was able to sign those into law, and I was down at the White House for that. And again, a very poignant moment with both President George Bush, W. Bush, and his father, President George Herbert Walker Bush, both being there for the signing of the ADA Act amendments. So thanks to that legislation of last year, people who were denied coverage under the ADA will now be covered. So as we celebrate the 19th anniversary of this great civil rights law, it's remarkable to think that many young people with disabilities have grown up taking advantages of these changes. And you know, they really have no memory of the way things used to be before the law was passed. I remembered recently I had, as we are wont to do as senators, I had my picture taken out here in the front of the Capitol with a group of young people, one of whom was using a wheelchair. And I was talking about the upcoming anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I had pointed to the curb cuts so that someone can come up and use a wheelchair. And I said, you know, those weren't there before 1990, to which this young person in a wheelchair was astounded to find this out. He just assumed that they'd always been able to move around freely. And so as we look around after 19 years, we see a lot of changes for the good. We see more young people taking advantage of educational opportunities, travel opportunities, families going out to restaurants, traveling with family members who have a disability, schools. So we see a lot of wonderful changes that have taken place because of the ADA. But quite frankly, Madam President, there's more work to do. We have not yet reached the promised land of those 4 goals of the ADA. And at the top of the list is the need to pass the Community Choice Act. Now, this bill's been around a long time. First introduced in the 1990s. It was then called MICASA, M-I-C-A-S-S-A. That stood for the Medicaid Community Attendance Support and Services Act. Well, no one could ever remember what it stood for, so we changed the name to the Community Choice Act. Now, what's this all about? Right now, all over America, there are people with disabilities who qualify for Medicaid coverage. They're low income, and they have severe disabilities, and so they qualify for Medicaid. If they want to get their full coverage for support services, they have to go to a nursing home. If they go to a nursing home under the law, Medicaid must pay for their support services. If they go to a nursing home, must pay. But let's say a person with a disability doesn't want to go to a nursing home. They'd kind of like to live in their own home. They'd like to live with their friends, their family, in the community, where they know people. Do they get any support services? None. Medicaid does not have to pay one single dime. If you go to a nursing home, they'll pay for it. If you want to stay in your own home and get those support services, Medicaid doesn't have to pay for it. So they don't have an equal right to choose where they want to live. Now, again, some states, I will say this, some states have applied for waivers, and they have extended these support services to people with disabilities in the community. But it varies from state to state. Some states don't have the waivers, some states do. And even in some states that have waivers, my state of Iowa has one, the waiting lists are long, take you 3 or 4 years to ever get up in the queue to be eligible. And so it's been a patchwork of different things around the country. Now, on top of that, in 1999, 9 years after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a case came to the Supreme Court. We call it the Olmstead case, Olmstead versus LC. Came out of Georgia. And the Supreme Court made an important decision. It said that individuals with disabilities have the right to choose to receive their long-term services and supports in the community rather than in an institutional setting. The Supreme Court said that. They have a right to that. So this year marks the 19th anniversary of the ADA. It marks the 10th anniversary of that decision by Olmstead by the Supreme Court. And yet, people with disabilities still have to go to a nursing home. Go to a nursing home to get their long-term services and supports. Listen to what the Supreme Court said in 1999. Quote, institutional placement of persons who can handle and benefit from community settings perpetuates unwarranted assumptions that persons so isolated are incapable or unworthy of participating in community life. End quote. Changing these assumptions is what the ADA is all about. Now, as again I said, some states have done it. It's kind of a patchwork quilt around the country. The Community Choice Act is focused on increasing the availability of attendant services and supports. Now, we know from studies done, the most important being done by Dr. Mitch LaPlante of the University of California at San Francisco, we know from studies that for a person with a disability to go into a nursing home to receive those long-term services and supports costs 3 times more than what it does in the community. In other words, it would cost 3 times as much. So for every 1 person in a nursing home, you can support 3 people living in their own homes in the community. Well, you'd say, well, why aren't we doing that? Well, because there's about 600,000 people in this country. And you know, these are individuals that are, they're on the bottom rung. Let's be frank about it. They're on the bottom rung of the economic ladder. They're poor because they're Medicaid eligible. They have varying degrees of disabilities that if they don't have their support services, they can't get out, they can't go to work, they may be capable of working. After all, we've got curb cuts, we've got buses that are accessible, we've got subways that are accessible, we mandated that employers must make reasonable accommodations. Wonderful. But if you can't even get out of your house in the morning, what good does all that do you? So, 600,000 people. CBO did a cost analysis and said this would cost about $50 billion over 10 years to do this. $50 billion over 10 years. Well, that's a lot of money. But keep in mind, the health care bill that we're talking about passing here, recent estimates by CBO put it at $1 trillion over 10 years. $1 trillion over 10 years. So 50 billion, that's about 5%. 5%. Is that too much to ask to help people on the lowest rung of the economic ladder in our country? To help them take advantage of what is their civil right? What the Supreme Court said that they have a right to live independently, a right to live in their own home, to get those services. Well, as we all know, civil rights like this are not self-executing. They require some support from the Congress. And quite frankly, I must tell you, I disagree with the estimate of the CBO, because here's what they don't take into account. They don't take into account that many of these people with disabilities who could live in the community, get these services and supports, can now get out the door in the morning and go to work, make a living, and pay taxes. I think of my nephew Kelly. My nephew Kelly was injured in the military. He was serving on an aircraft carrier, got sucked down a jet engine, lived. But he's a severe paraplegic for the rest of his life. Now, my nephew Kelly came back out of the military. When he had that terrible accident, he was 19 years old, big strapping kid. Went to school, went to college. Then he lived by himself, still does, lives in his own home, has a van that he drives with a lift on it, Gets up in the morning, goes to work, comes back. How is he able to do this? Because he has support services. He has someone that comes in his house in the morning, gets him ready. Someone that comes in the house at night, gets him ready for bed, but he does his own cooking, does his own shopping. But he has to have a nurse, someone there to help him get going. Now, if he didn't have that, he wouldn't be able to go to work. But he has that, now he goes to work, and he's a tax-paying citizen of this country. There are hundreds of thousands of Kellys around this country who, if they had that support mechanism, could go to work. So when they say it costs $50 billion, I say, well, you're not taking that into account. And they aren't taking that into account. So as we enter the critical stage in hammering out comprehensive health care reform, we must not miss this opportunity to extend the availability of attendant supports and services, which so many have been fighting for so many years. Every individual with a significant disability deserves the choice about where to live and with whom to live and where to receive his or her essential services. Now, that has a lot to do with employment. And as I look back over 19 years of the ADA, there's one thing that is still lacking, and that is employment of people with disabilities. Recent surveys show that 63% of people with disabilities are unemployed. They want to work. They have abilities, but they're unemployed. A lot of this is because there are no support services. Much of this has to do with the fact that some employers are not providing reasonable accommodations. Some of it has to do with the fact there's not really an affirmative action program to hire people with disabilities. 21 million people with disabilities of working age are not employed. So we need to do a better job in providing these people with disabilities the opportunity for economic self-sufficiency, as we promised in the ADA. On a closing note, Madam President, on Friday of last week, President Obama announced that the United States will sign the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, an international treaty that identifies the rights of persons living with disabilities and obligates countries to maintain those rights. That convention, after it will be signed, I understand this week, by our ambassador to the UN, will go through a process and then it will be referred to the United States Senate for ratification. Well, we should take pride in the fact the United States has always been a leader in ensuring the rights of individuals with disabilities. We have made great progress towards the goals of equal opportunity and full participation and independent living and economic self-sufficiency. By becoming a party to the convention, the United States will continue its leadership role. So on this 19th anniversary of the ADA, I want to thank our President, President Barack Obama. Thank him for the statement he made last Friday that he was going to sign this week and maintain the United States leadership role in ensuring the rights of people with disabilities. I only hope that the convention will get through the process rapidly, that we can get it to the United States Senate, and I hope the United States Senate can ratify it as soon as possible. And lastly, Madam President, on a more poignant note, I just want to pause on this anniversary to remember people who played such a vital role in passing the ADA. Some are no longer with us, such as Justin Dart, who was really the person who really pulled it through. Justin Dart. We are fortunate his wife Yoshiko continues to carry on his legacy day after day and week after week and year after year. We remember Ed Roberts, the father of the independent living movement, whose work and vision continue to inspire us powerfully. He's also gone. Others who are still with us, Pat Wright, my staff director, Bobby Silverstein, who worked so hard to pull this through. And of course, the one person who, when the going got tough and when we didn't know if we could get everything pulled together, worked his magic to bring people on both sides of the aisle together. And herein I speak of Senator Ted Kennedy, the chairman of the committee. Now, I was privileged to be the chairman of the Disability Policy Subcommittee, but that was under the tutelage of Senator Kennedy. He was the chairman of the committee, the HELP committee at that time. And it was because of his great work that we were able to pull people together to get the great compromise to pass the ADA. I would just mention one other person that I think might be somewhat responsible is no longer with us, and that's my late brother Frank. I've spoken about him many times, my inspiration for working on disability issues. Frank became a deaf at a young age, and he was taken from our home and sent across the state to the Iowa School for the Deaf. At that time, many people called it the State School for the Deaf and Dumb. That's how they referred to people who couldn't hear as deaf and dumb. And I remember my brother said to me one time, I may be deaf, but I'm not dumb. He also said to me one time, he said, the only thing that deaf people can't do is hear. And he fought, not only in school, but after school, to be independent and to have his make his own way in life. And he was able to do that. I saw how many times he was discriminated against, whether it was getting a driver's license or whatever. It was so many things that he was discriminated against, told he couldn't do because he was deaf. And so they were always trying to hold him back, but he was always pushing. He was able to carve out a life of independence and dignity for himself, but I often thought, why did he have to fight so hard for all this? And why did he have to struggle so much just to get people to accept him for what he was and who he was? And not just to look that he was a deaf man, that he was deaf, but that he was a person of great capabilities, great ethics, great work, very hardworking. But why did he have to struggle? And then I started to look around and saw all these people with disabilities in America that just had to overcome almost insurmountable obstacles just to be a contributing member of our society, not to get welfare. My brother was never on welfare in one day in his entire lifetime. Always worked hard. They just want to work and contribute, be a part of our society. Why did it require extraordinary efforts to do things that we just take for granted in our country? So he was sort of my inspiration and continues on today. So, yes, we've had our share of frustrations. We've not reached the promised land. We've got 60% or more unemployment. And people with disabilities have to go to a nursing home to get their supports rather than living in the community. So we do have a ways to go. We've come a long ways, but we do have a ways to go. So we can celebrate this great law, this great civil rights bill, the Americans with Disabilities Act. But now we also have to say we have to take these next steps. On July the 26th, 1990, when he signed the ADA into law, President George Bush spoke with great eloquence. And I will never forget his final words before taking up his pen. He said, quote, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." Well, Madam President, today that wall is indeed falling. We have to continue the progress. We have to go forward and not backward. We must enact the Community Choice Act so that people with disabilities can finally have not only independence, but they can have full participation and they can have economic self-sufficiency. Their home, not the nursing home, has been their cry for many years. We ought to hear that, we ought to heed it, and we should make sure that we don't pass a health reform bill unless we have something in there to address this one fundamental flaw in our society that wreaks havoc against people with disabilities in our country. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.